Okay, so my presentation is grade check, and it's about standardizing grades at Brighton High School. So first, I need 2 volunteers, and it would help if they're sitting right next to each other. So 2 volunteers. Okay, thanks guys. So, this is a quiz, it's super easy, just fill it out. Quiz and pencils. So they just took their pop quiz. So while they're working on that, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of grading. So why do we have grades in the first place? Grades are useful for determining class ranking, and they help teachers group students into categories based on their performance, and they also help students be rewarded from working harder versus not working as hard. With the current system, just like in life, grades can help. They can help us apply for scholarships, for colleges, for jobs. So grading really is essential. There are some drawbacks and limitations, like grade inflation or learning motives. But grades are still the best method we have for determining educational merit, so we still use them. Like for example, this picture is a study, and they followed a bunch of valedictorians and salutatorians, and they found that 95% earned college degrees with an average GPA of 3.6, 60% went to graduate school, 90% are in professional jobs, and 40% are in the highest tiers of those jobs. So what this is saying is that like it obviously takes a lot of work to be a valedictorian and salutatorian, and they have good grades, and they found that grades can help predict how well they're going to do in life, even though they're not perfect. So where do grades come from? You can thank Yale President Ezra Stiles in 1785 for issuing the first grades, and these were optimi, second optimi, inferiores, boni, and pejores. Many other colleges followed after Yale. They developed their own method of grading, but they used all sorts of different crazy scales. Like for example, William and Mary's College used the words orderly, correct, and attentive to describe a class ranking, which is just odd. And so, everyone had their own system, and even these were constantly changing. For example, Yale went from a 4-point scale to a 9-point scale, and Harvard used scales ranging from 20 points to 9 points. So the point is, all sorts of colleges were using all sorts of random scales, and it's hard to work between different colleges to compare grading. Then both Harvard and Mount Holyoke are credited with creating the first 5-point percentage-based scales that use letters to help depict what grades the students received. And these are similar to those that are commonly seen today. And immediately after this, lots of other schools followed suit, and they used, what basically happened is they standardized grading throughout America. And instead of having random different grading scales between each school, all the schools started using similar scales. And this made comparisons between different schools much more reasonable and dependable, so you could actually accurately compare gradings between different schools. And so this brings us to the current status of Brighton's grading. So right now, teachers can choose whatever percentage they want for their grading scale, and this means that an A in one class could be a certain percentage, like say 90%, but an A in a different class could be a different percentage, say 95%. And so the same reward in A could be a different percentage in different classes. And so the problem with this is the same problem that early 19th century colleges faced, and it's confusion. It's confusing when comparing letter grades. They're not totally valid because the percentage that the teachers offer can change. And so the same letter in one class might not be the same in different classes. So you can't compare them validly. Also, attempting to understand the grading scales for each teacher you have makes things more difficult than they have to be. So it makes you have to do extra work to compare grades between the same class. So are you guys done with your quiz?
Yeah.
Do you mind handing this to me? So, looking at the results of these quizzes, both Hyatt and Isaac got 4 out of 5 correct, which is an 80%. And that makes it, they got the same score, so you should think that they should get rewarded the same. However, in some cases, Isaac could get a certain letter like a B+, and Hyatt could get like a B-, even though they got the same percentage on their grade. Now obviously this is kind of an over-exaggeration, but it's still, the point I'm trying to make is that you can do the same percentage for a grade, but you can get a different reward for that. So possibilities for the future. So I conducted a survey and found that 90% of people felt that they wanted a standardized grading scale. So this is an image of a grading scale, and this is actually pretty difficult, and this is just an example of what a possible standardized scale could be. So the ideal option would be to standardize the grading scale throughout the entirety of Brighton, but there are some pros and cons to this, and so other standardization options include standardizing the scale between different departments, like the English department, science department. You could have a certain scale for each department, which would be a lot easier to implement. And you could also do it based on class rigor. So like regular classes could have a certain scale, and then harder classes like AP and honors could have a harder or a different grading scale. So that brings you to the solution. So basically, like I already mentioned it, but the solution would be to create a new grading scale throughout Brighton. It's a simple solution, and it costs no money, which is a pro of it. And so this will be done. There's lots of different contingencies that are involved with creating a new grading scale. So, and it directly affects the faculty of Brighton, so I figured that they should have some direct input in how this should be implemented. So I did this through the creation of a survey. And then the results of this survey will then be generalized into the ideal grading scale, which would then be incorporated into Brighton. I said the next year here, but really just as soon as possible. So just a little bit more details on this grading survey. So each of these 3 questions would be asked to the teachers. So the first question says, what are the ideal divisions between pluses and minuses? This question basically, it helps determine the best percentage for grading, the ideal percentage that each teacher would want. And then when we would compile the results of this survey, we could find out the most common results and then implement that into the grading scale. Question 2 says, should honors and AP classes have harder scales? And so this question came up because during my survey and interviews, both people in both of these mentioned that it could be possible to make divisions between class rigor. This would both challenge students that take harder classes, but also reward them for giving them a higher reward for taking a harder class and working for a harder GPA or a harder grading scale. And the third question would be, should there be differences between departments? And so additional responses, I found that different scales between departments would be a lot more realistic. It might be harder to standardize it throughout all of Brighton, so another option, just to get the feedback, would be to help see if there's differences between departments. And then so once you get these questions out and you get the feedback from the teachers, you can combine and generalize the results and then hopefully implement a new standardized grading scale throughout Brighton. Those are my work cited.